The Seventh Son by Barry Tomorrow. This is the Southampton, Hampshire outfit's 7th studio album, arriving March 31st via Music for Nations. The Seventh Son consists of 11 tracks, clocks in at around 42 minutes, and Sam is the much anticipated follow-up to 2020's Cannibal LP, which was the last album to feature the band's founding rhythm guitarist and clean vocalist James Cameron before he left the band in July of 2021. And on that note, extremely important to then note, it's the first album from Barry Tomorrow to feature the band's new rhythm guitarist Ed Hartwell and keyboardist / clean vocalist Tom Prendergast. So, just on paper,
yeah,
it took 2 members to replace 1 member of Barry Tomorrow.
It's got to make you feel good, you know.
It's got to make you
feel good. Like, looking back, you're like, couldn't just get another vocalist. You had to double up to replace me.
But of course, important.
I hope wherever Jason is out there that he's doing well.
Obviously, that's not all that Barry Tomorrow did. They really recalibrated, and what's super important to emphasize is that the new vocalist Tom isn't only a new vocalist. This band has emphasized the fact that we now have a keyboardist in our band. That's also Tom, which was a I was going to say missing feature. Yes,
a non-existent
feature in Barry Tomorrow of albums past. You know, we had 6 of them. They didn't really have a heavy keyboard influence by any means. But on the topic of the old vocalist, you know, before we get into the full discussion about just this album, where did we really leave off with Barry Tomorrow here at the show?
I was very hyped on Cannibal. You were less enthusiastic.
Yeah, and I think I had certainly started to shift back in the favor of this band's sound with Cannibal, but there was a minute for a couple of albums where I think it was Dark Flame.
Mm-hmm.
There might have been one that came after that, and
there was no other one.
Wasn't even
right. The album after that was.
So to give you an idea of my headspace, I had sort of grown a little tired and bored of the Barry Tomorrow formula. At least in practice. On paper, nothing really changed. It was still the same band, and I do think actually that was part of the problem. Personally, preference-wise for myself, was that I needed something a little more different. I needed something that was maybe a little new and exciting, and that iteration of that band, that lineup, maybe wasn't providing it. They were still providing really solid music, especially with Cannibal, but for a band that had put out like one of my favorite albums of all time, I certainly wasn't holding them in that same regard that I did when they released Ruin specifically.
I think part of the pieces is that we came in an album that I think was absolutely so extraordinary that it was difficult for this band to maybe match up to it moving forward, at least in terms of like our admiration or what it is that we were looking for the band based on, you know, the point in time that we discovered them.
Yeah, and I think it's important to bring a lot of that up because, and you know, we've gotten certainly our handful of singles. Even leading up to before we got singles for this album, like there's songs that didn't make the cut on this one. And I think obviously longtime fans of this band may have some reservations coming into it because the old vocalist, the old clean vocalist is certainly adored. And one thing I'll say is that like, admire that voice, love that voice personally. I just didn't know if it was this. It was still the right fit in Barry Tomorrow, but that band member leaving, I think, was a good catalyst, especially for me as a fan. Like, it reinvigorated my enthusiasm. It rejuvenated me.
What's
my
interesting
enthusiasm for this band changed, where I think it's funny because I feel like that's in contrast to the rest of their fan base, where suddenly they had reservations about the future of Barry Tomorrow. Like, what's going to happen with this band? And, you know, that may have been quelled or whatever, calmed when new singles with the new singer started coming out in consistent fashion. But for me personally, like I was less worried.
Well, what's interesting is that it also reinvigorated the band. So when I was reading sort of about, the band's thought process with this new record, a lot of it was talking about kind of how they were able to sort of go back to the drawing board and then maybe not necessarily re-envision Bury Tomorrow, but kind of
Retool.
Yeah, in a way that they were able to reach a goal that they aspired to that they maybe had struggled to reach in the past, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it is worth noting that this band kind of looks at new members as a net benefit to the overall project as well, even though obviously it is difficult losing a founding member.
Yeah, and I think what they probably certainly did was a pretty like strenuous vetting process of finding the exact right fit for this band. And, you know, whether it was one member or two members or three members, ultimately they landed where they landed. And I guess to really just jump into the album, I think they made a lot of great decisions because the payoff, at least personally as a fan of this band, a longtime fan, was extraordinary. They delivered on pretty much everything that I've not only been asking for out of them for a long time, but as far as implementing new members into this band, flawless execution.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is a statement record. I think it's powerful and it's punchy and it comes out of the gates explicitly saying you need to either start or continue paying attention to Bury Tomorrow. And I'd like to think that that's kind of like the drive this band has, because you're right. The fan base, and even me at the time, to be honest, looked at the loss of Jason and said, man, this kind of fucking sucks, because for all intents and purposes, they had an extremely unique voice within the metalcore scene. And I attributed a lot of my adoration to Bury Tomorrow to that voice. And I thought it paired exceptionally well with Daniel Winter Bates, who obviously remains in the band and is the screamer. And I think that's the biggest success here, is that with Tom, they found someone else who continues to pair really well, right? And Tom gets integrated like immaculately on this record. The balance between him and Dan is really well done, and I appreciate that this band is also willing to say, hey, even though this is a new, less familiar face and we still retain someone you're overly familiar with Daniel, that doesn't mean we're not going to allow Tom to sort of be able to run on some of these other tracks, right?
And
they end up being
Tom
some
does.
of the standouts.
Take Majesty, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to rack my brain earlier. You know, I didn't have the pleasure to go back and listen to the last 6 albums before checking this one out, but I struggle to remember if Jason had ever just been essentially given a song just to themselves.
I think that has been the case.
But I guess then what's even more surprising is the band's willingness and eagerness to do the same with Tom on the first album with the new lineup.
Right. So it's almost like it's less of an easing and like straight throwing him into the fire, right?
Right. Yeah. It's essentially saying like, yeah, no, this is currently, yes, we're all about this right now. Just fit in. And I think that Tom does a really great job of doing that. I mentioned Majesty. I say that it's mainly a Tom song. That doesn't mean Daniel doesn't come back in a little later on in the track. And you know, when that hits, like it comes with the breakdown and everything. And it's a real great payoff to like the 2.5 minutes beforehand where not as much of that is happening. But like, it's the exact type of decision making like that really does make this such an enjoyable listening experience. Not only just listening to these, you know, specific minutes of songs, but in general. Like, again, I had kind of grown bored with the formula that Bury Tomorrow had, and I feel like we switched things up a lot. Like, I think this band's had features in the past, but like, just having one on this album helps. Like, just decision making like that, really everything pays off on this
right. So
album.
what's interesting is that other sort of standout track that I really sort of attribute to Tom would be the Carcass King, which is the closer here, and that includes a feature from Cody Frost, who's been absolutely on fire in terms of like the British alt scene with their features with Enter Shikari and You Me at 6 as well.
3 for 3, and there's probably more.
Yeah, just one of the most exciting artists coming up in the scene right now. But, for all intents and purposes, though, the metalcore is still there and it's still fucking strong. I think Abandon Us and Wrath are two absolute fucking standout tracks
Wrath
in
is
this band's
insane.
overall discography.
Yeah, and throw like Bolt Cutter in there as well. It's just like, I don't know. There's such a different air to this album. Like everything, and this is probably because it happens to be the case, but like I mentioned earlier that there was like kind of no pressure on this band, but from a like pull out wider lens, like there was absolutely a ton at stake here. And I think that this band certainly approached this album with a chip on their shoulder and a lot to prove. And you fucking hear it.
Yeah.
Like, there are times where this band is like visceral.
Speaking of features, you also have Lost Taylor on Heretic, and that's one of those tracks where I do really feel like this band is not necessarily screaming to be heard, but sort of showcasing their talent and what makes them such a fucking must-hear metalcore band. Like, I will never fucking tire of Bury Tomorrow riffs. Like they have their peaks and valleys. Like, there are my favorite. There are the albums that like the idealized version of this band is like best showcase, but they're never not like engaging. And it's one of the things that I've always come to this band for, and I feel like they really are highlighted well here. Maybe in ways that like a couple of those albums that you were less like fond of, they really showed up. But for me, from Cannibal to this, I do still feel like Bury Tomorrow, like in the bones of their project, are still incredibly strong.
What's funny, just a small tangent that's a backtrack to when we were discussing their albums earlier. There was an album in between the Black Flame and Runes.
Black Flame and Cannibal?
No, Black Flame and like Earthbound or whatever.
It goes Runes, Earthbound,
Right.
Black Flame and Cannibal. Yes, that's
Got it.
correct. That was the album that you couldn't think of at the time, and it's probably maybe like there is that point where you have Black Flame and the
Earthbound?
album Earthbound, yes, that I think this band maybe lost their footing a little bit. Or maybe they were trying some things out that I was less interested in.
Absolutely at no point bad by any means, but just I kind of just really grown like too familiar with what they were doing, and there were no surprises. And I think that an important difference between this album and some of the more recent ones is just that there's a lot of surprise and a lot of maybe magic that wasn't always there.
I feel like, in a sense, Cannibal was hitting the gas, and then this album, The Seventh Son, is hitting the nitro.
Right. We were never at 0, but suddenly we're at 60 and like gaining speed fast.
And I love the overall sort of atmosphere that this album has, and sort of how that's established with the opening track, the title track itself.
The Seventh Son, right? I don't know. Like I like the overall, like you talk atmosphere. I also like the overall tone. Like we talk about this band having a chip on their shoulder. Like it's very much there with like the subject matter and how they're belting out their choruses and how they're delivering their lows and their highs.
They're aggravated, and it benefits them. And it contrasts well with the new elements that they bring in, like those synth and like the different sort of things they do in the production side. What would you give this overall?
So I actually think that this is a 4, if not potentially a 4.5.
Interesting.
Personally.
So you're coming really hot on this.
This is by and large my favorite record from this band since the Runes days. I absolutely love the way that the new members have been integrated. I think that it is an injection of excitement that I personally needed as a fan of theirs. I think that it's I think one thing I want to say is like, not to discredit Tom by any means. Like I think Jason is an incredible vocalist. I might even say he's better than Tom, but I just think that Tom right here, right now makes so much more sense for this band than Jason does. And that's why personally, I'm so arms wide open, accepting of this member change, of this new album. And again, I understand a lot of that's personal preference, and much of their fan base might not feel the same way, at least having like not heard the record. But personally, this is exactly what I wanted from this band. They delivered on a lot of the expectations I had heading into this, and I'm really just, at the end of the day, super happy with this record. I absolutely love it. I adore it.
I'm a little cooler on it. I'm somewhere around a 3.5, which I think it is a very good record from a very well-established band that manages to make things more exciting than they have been recently. But I do look at this and I have one of those moments where I feel like there's an even better version of this album to follow it based off of like the precedent that they've set.
But it's always great when like you say you're ready for the next album, but it's not because this current one sucks. It's just because of the promise that this band has so much left in their tank suddenly.
Right. Like you've lit a fire under my
Right.
fandom with this album.
Bear Tomorrow, The Seventh Son. Check it out when you can.